Welcome everyone to the fall season of the Future of Financial Information, or FutFinInfo webinar series. It's great to be back after the summer, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Florian Berg from MIT and Christoph Schiller from Arizona State University, who will be the main protagonists today. So for those of you just joining the series, the webinar runs for 1 hour, divided into 30 minutes presentation. So that's going to be Florian today, and then 15 minutes discussion from Christoph, and the last 15 minutes open Q&A. So Florian asked you, for the benefit of patience, that you actually let him present for 30 minutes straight. And so we'll take questions after Christoph's discussion, but feel free to submit your questions to the chat in the meantime, so I can keep an eye on them, and maybe some of them will be answered during the talk, and those that are still open at the end, we'll take them during the discussion. So without further ado, let me turn over to Florian. So please share your screen, and you have 30 minutes.
Hi, so I'm Florian. Thank you for joining the webinar. I'm going to present today joint work with Julian Körbel from University of Zurich and Roberto Rigoban from MIT Sloan. And the project we started 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, realizing going after to loads of different conferences in sustainable finance, that there were always the same questions or the same critique. It was about the data. And so we thought that we should really take a step back and look at the data and try to actually explain why there's so much different data. And very fast after we downloaded or we received our data sets, our environmental, social, and governance rating data sets, we realized that there's a lot of aggregation going on and also a lot of confusion. So hence the title, Aggregate Confusion. Yeah, so and you can see that ESG ratings have been becoming very important in over the last 10 years, because there are investors with over 80 trillion US dollars that pledged to integrate ESG information via the UN PRI. And there are also big financial players in the financial information service industry that are actually buying those existing ESG rating agencies. MSCI bought Innovest and KLD through risk metrics. Moody's bought Vigeo Eiris. Standard & Poor bought RobecoSAM. Morningstar has an association with Sustainalytics, and ISS bought Econ. So, and I'm pretty sure you already came across those ESG ratings. So you've heard of that divergence and the non-correlation between those rating agencies, or the ESG ratings. Just let me show you how bad it is actually. When you look at, this is our 6 rating agencies or ESG ratings that we actually have in our sample. Asset 4, RobecoSAM, Sustainalytics, Vigeo Eiris, MSCI, and KLD. And the correlations range between 38% to 71%. This has implications for investors, because if they're in the presence of so much divergence, they don't really know which companies are good, because you can be have a good rating with RobecoSAM and a bad rating with MSCI. It also has pricing implications. There are loads of studies that look at the link between sustainable performance and financial performance. And if there's noise or dilution through that noise in the signal, then those investors have less buying power. Also, if there is, if sustainable investing should lead to an overperformance, which some academic studies state, then the solution of the signal would be, or this errors in variables problem would make it harder to detect. Companies that actually rated have another problem. They don't really know what it is expected of them. And academics, they struggle how to find out what is actually the right data set to take, and if you have results with one data set, can you generalize that with other rated data sets? So what we did is we after looking at the data sets, and we realized that there are actually three sources of potential divergence, and that is, one is the scope divergence, so which attributes are included. For example, gender bias. Do I include it or not? The second source of divergence is measurement. How do I measure gender bias? Do I look at the pay gap, or do I look at promotions? If men get more promotions or women get more promotions in the company, they both proxy for the same. Those indicators both proxy for the same, category. That is, or dimension, that is gender bias, but they for sure will not have the same result. And the last source of divergence is weights. Weights is the relative importance of those indicators. So when you look at, for example, if you include CO2 emissions and gender bias, what is more important? What has the higher weight? In the following part, I will now actually tell you how we did actually disentangle those three sources of divergence and give you the results. But let's first talk about the data. So as you saw, we have 6 raters in our data set. Those 6 raters are KLD, Sustainalytics, Vigeo Eiris, RobecoSAM, Asset4, and MSCI. KLD is a little bit apart because it's not technically used by investors anymore, but there's so many academic studies because it's the data set with the longest historical time series, that we thought it was very important to put it in our study. That also restricts our baseline year to 2014. But we will actually, in our paper, we do actually perform a robustness check for 2017 with excluding KLD. It doesn't really change that much. So from those 6 raters, we collected the high-level ESG, the aggregate rating, and we also collected the indicators. And the indicators would be, for example, gender bias or CO2 emissions. And KLD has 78, Sustainalytics has 163, Vigeo Eiris only 38, and Asset4, for example, 282. As you can see, there's a lot of heterogeneity in that sample because of those different numbers of indicators. So the problem is now, how do we actually compare them? How do we actually create a common language so we can disentangle the 3 sources of divergence? What we did is we created a taxonomy, and this taxonomy we created it in a way that we looked at all the 6 raters, and whenever there were 2 or more raters that had indicators in a certain that kind of belonged together, we actually created a new category. So this is the example for water. Here, as we can see, Asset4 has 3, KLD has 2, RobecoSAM has 2 as well. MSCI is only 1 with water stress management. Yeah. So this is actually our common language between those different rating agencies. And this is a little bit the heart of the paper. So since we sometimes put more than one category, more than one indicator in a category, for example, with asset 4.3, then we need actually now to figure out if that's actually a good approximation, because we just take the average out of those 3 indicators. We tried to use other procedures, but it turns out that this is actually a very good approximation. And I will show you after the next slide why that is. So now we have this common language. Now we can calculate actually the correlations between those categories. And we have, in total, we have 64 categories. We have quite a lot of unclassified indicators as well that are just, that are just exclusive to one ESG rater. So for them, we don't create a category, but we will feed them in our analysis, and I will tell you how. But let's talk about this slide, the different correlations on the category level. So if you look at, for example, those correlations, they range from -46% to 85% and even 92%. So they're all over the place. And it's quite interesting because when you look at, for example, responsible marketing between KLD and Sustainalytics, so in the first column, but very on the bottom, at the bottom, -50%, that there's a fair chance if something has a good rating with KLD, it has a very good rating with KLD, it has a very bad rating with Sustainalytics. And that is quite surprising. Other correlations are actually higher. For example, Global Compact member, UN Global Compact member, 92% between Sustainalytics and Asset 4. But then 92% seems high, but UN Global Compact membership is easily verifiable. You just go on the UN Global Compact website, there's a database, you type in the name of the firm, you want to find out if they signed, when they signed the UN Global Compact, and you get straight away the answer. So I thought maybe there's some temporal effects, that's why we have a low correlation. But it turns out actually both Sustainalytics and Asset 4 make mistakes here. So that is very surprising. What that slide tells us already is that there's a measurement divergence. Because on the category level, it's the same topic, but the measurement is different. So we see, and there's a lot. So now what we did actually is, we reverse engineered the ESG rating. So we regressed each ESG rating for each rater on the indicators, but in our categorization. And by this, we want to find out if we can actually, with our common language, with our taxonomy, if we can reconstruct the rating, and by that prove that this is actually a good way to do it. And when you look at the bottom, the R squared is actually very high. So it's around north of 90% for most of them, except for MSCI, where it's at 79%. So that means that there is actually, that this is a good way. Yeah, the taxonomy, we accept the taxonomy and we can use it in our disentanglement. So what you also see is that the weights are different. So all the data is standardized, so we can actually compare the coefficients. And when you look at access to healthcare at the top, the coefficients vary. They are the same for KLD and Sustainalytics, but MSCI is different, and RobecoSAM is also different, and Asset 4 is also different. So we see that there's a difference of a weight divergence. We also see that there's a scope divergence because the dashes show that this category doesn't exist for that given rater. So now we would like to attribute how much the one source, each source contributes to the divergence. So those are the results. Scope on average is 0.48, and this is actually in standard deviations. Measurement is 0.54 and weights is 0.34. So that means measurement is actually the biggest source of divergence, followed by scope and then by weights. What you also can see that it's fairly similar. Sorry, it's fairly similar for all raters except for MSCI, where scope is actually the biggest source of divergence. The reason why that is in the methodology, because they have some sort of, they have their management policy scores, and then they have their risk exposure scores, and risk exposure scores, they do not have an equivalent with other raters that contributes to the divergence in source in scope. So in the paper, it's very much more detailed. So this is actually the average for each rater, and then the bottom is the average of those averages. In our paper, we have it detailed for each rater pair. So KLD with, for example, Sustainalytics and so on. It just, yeah, it wouldn't fit on the slide. And also, this is actually the main message. So what you now can do, actually, you can use our methodology in order to find out why a rating between two different raters is different for a given firm. So our example here is Berg Gold Corporation, and that we chose Asset4 and KLD. And what you can see is that the difference between in the rating is actually 1.5 standard deviations. So that's the orange. Those are the two orange. And we can also see that when we look at one of the biggest source of contribution is actually remuneration. And that's the differences in measurement. So this methodology companies or investors can use it to disentangle all those why there's so much disagreement. And you can see that measurement is the biggest source of divergence here between Asset4 and KLD, and then it's followed by weight and then by scope. So now we wanted to explain a little bit more about the measurement divergence. And we found actually something we called a rater effect or halo effect. And an example of how you can actually think about this is that so the assessment of a firm by a rater is influenced by the view of the firm. So how you can think about it is that, remember when you went to school, to middle school, and you had a teacher, and he had him in 5 different classes. In 4 you excelled, in 1 you weren't that good, but you most likely got a better grade than you actually deserved in the 5th subject. And that is because you had this halo effect. The teacher was convinced that you're a good student, so he let himself influence by that. And we see actually the same thing happening in the rating space, in the ESG rating space. So when we explain firm idiosyncratic variation in the first line firm, it explains 22%. And when we then add the rater effect, it explains 14 to 16%. That means that the rater effect is actually quite strong. It's almost as strong as the firm idiosyncratic variation. We did the same. We proved that through a regression on dummies. So we took the category scores and regressed them on dummies from the whole sample. So then we could actually get rid of cross effects between different raters. Another way of showing that there's actually a rater effect, and that is a more intuitive way, and that is we wanted to find out how much actually categories do you need to explain a rater's ESG rating. So we actually regressed. We did what we on a couple of slides before with the reverse engineering. We regressed the ESG rating of every rater on its categories, and we added. We tried to find out which category explains most of that rating. And so we chose the category that explained most, then second we chose a category that explained a little bit less, and so on. And as you can see, actually it's quite interesting because, for example, look at RobecoSAM. So 1 means 100% of the variance explained, and we only need 10 or maybe 9 categories in order to explain almost the whole rating, and it doesn't get better than after that. Same for asset 4, we only need 18 out of 282. Vigeo Eiris is only 8-9 out of 38, and Sustainalytics is 10 out of 78, I think. The only difference is KLD and MSCI. MSCI, as you can see, is more or less quite a straight line. So yeah, there you actually need the full set in order to reconstruct the ESG rating. So this is this is actually another way of showing the rater effect, because that means there are some categories that are redundant. So the first categories that we add here almost explain everything, and that is because the analyst probably had a certain view of the company, and then he rated it across according to his view. So we then did a lot of robustness checks. We did everything because we created our own taxonomy, but we also wanted to create. We wanted to look at how actually the whole paper holds up if we use the SASB criteria, the 26. So we did this, and the results are very much unchanged. We also, so I showed you only the results about the decomposition, but not actually the math behind it. So we came actually up with 2 ways of doing it, and both deal with the weaknesses of the other decomposition. And you find that in the paper. So as I said, we did the same analysis for 2017. And we also, we used rankings instead of normalized data. And as I said, the results aren't changed. So the key findings is that measurement is the most important source of ESG rating divergence, and measurement is in part driven by a rater effect. The implications now. This is my last slide, and then I'm looking forward to your questions. So for academics, if you use a single rating, you have to carefully justify it. As you see, there's so much divergence and the correlations are so low that you cannot just use one rater and then generalize this is actually sustainable development or sustainable performance does this. So that would be a very important first step. The other way would be maybe to deal with the noise by taking an average out of a couple of raters. And by that, actually, reducing the noise and the errors and variables. For companies, Our methodology, as I showed you, can help to figure out why scores diverge. That is something companies struggle a lot when I talk to them, and they actually get really frustrated. And sometimes I heard of a couple of head of sustainability in major companies that they just said, yeah, why they're so frustrated that they actually don't want to even report anything anymore or talk to the rating agencies. So there definitely, there definitely has to be more communication on that side from the rating agencies to the companies, or maybe another company that offers that explanation why those ratings differ. So for rating agencies, we should show that the differences between raters are not merely conceptual differences. So scope and weight divergence would be a conceptual difference, because it's how you define actually the concept of sustainability, how you define sustainability. But there's also a big measurement difference, or even a bigger. So I think that actually calls for more transparency on the rating agency side, that actually people can check how they actually came up with that number, how they actually measured certain things in detail. Because companies have to be able to criticize them, and also researchers and NGOs. Then the rater effect has also big implications for the organizational structure of rating agencies, because it seems, for me, it always seemed a little bit odd that if you have that they are organized by firms, meaning an ESG an ESG analyst often has in his portfolio 5 to 10 firms and looks at all the indicators regarding those firms. But how can you actually be a specialist in human rights and CO2 emissions and in corruptions and all that? I think that is something rating agencies have to ask themselves in the future, how they actually want to deal with it. For investors, it's definitely a call for, you just don't buy a rating just like that, and then you just don't care about it anymore. I think it's either you have to be very convinced that this is the right methodology for you, and you have to be able also as an investor to defend it to your clients, or you actually buy the raw data, what a lot of big asset managers do, and you construct your own. And by that, maybe taking averages on the category level to reduce noise. There are different procedures to reduce noise and errors and variables. Okay, that was my paper. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm looking forward to your questions now.
Thank you very much, Florian, for taking us through this arcane world of ESG data. So now let me turn over to Christoph Schiller for his discussion. So you actually got about 2 to 3 minutes extra. Florian finished ahead of time, so please, Christoph, you can share your screen and give us your comments.
Great, let me just share mine then. All right, where is it? Where is, 1 second. There it is. All right, can you see the slides?
Yes, we do.
Wonderful, great. All right, so first of all, thank you very much for having me discuss this paper. This is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. As someone who has worked with this type of data in my own projects and my own work, I can tell you I feel your pain. And first of all, I appreciate the work that you've done. I learned a lot from reading this, and I think it's going to help a lot of academics inform their work in the future and make them think maybe much more carefully about what indicators they use and how they justify the use of those in their own work. So I think Florian did a fantastic job at summarizing what the paper is about. So I'm not going to spend too much time on it and just quickly go over this. The paper has a very, very clear and strong motivation. On the one hand side, we have this fact that we can observe that today a lot of money, depending on what number or what year you look at, it's a little bit different, but a lot of money, $30 trillion in assets, or as Florian said, $80 trillion, are being invested using some sort of ESG criteria to make these investment decisions. And obviously, as a result, you see that the demand for this ESG data has gone up tremendously, right? So the amount of money that firms spend on purchasing ESG ratings data has gone up by a factor of 2.5 over just a few years, and I'm sure since if we tracked it further, this number would go up even further. But then, despite this this enormous demand and this importance for financial investment decisions and corporate policies and outcomes, we observe, and this is something that the literature has documented, that these ESG ratings vary quite tremendously. There's significant differences in the scores that you get depending on which ratings agency you ask. And this paper, Florian's paper, really is after an important and simple question, that is, why is that? Why is it possible? How is it possible that these rating agencies seemingly are looking at the same thing and are trying to evaluate the same characteristic about a given firm, but they arrive at wildly different results? And what's really new about this paper is that they try to answer this question by breaking down the differences between ESG ratings into sort of three different categories of where these differences come from, right? They call this scope, measurement, and weighting differences, arguing that either the differences are due to the fact that the rating agencies try to measure different items, they focus on different attributes. So obviously, if you focus on different attributes, you're going to arrive at different conclusions. Alternatively, this might be due to measurement. So even if you focus on the same attributes, you might measure them differently and therefore arrive at different conclusions, or due to weighting. So you might look at the same categories, you might look at the same attributes, you might measure them similarly, but you might put different weights on different items, which also would result in different ratings, right? And so they collect data from 6 very well-known ratings agencies. These have been used, as Florian said, in a ton of academic papers, but also are widely used by the industry and by practitioners. And then they undertake what I really truly call a Herculean task. And that is to take all of the underlying data items, and in some cases that is really hundreds of data items, hundreds of individual indicators from each of those 6 ratings agencies, and try to fit them into a common taxonomy, right? Try to fit them into common categories, which then allows them to evaluate how much of the differences between these ESG ratings comes from scope, comes from measurement, and comes from weighting differences. The key idea being that if you put them in the same taxonomy, then you can compare how many of these categories are overlapping, or which categories are overlapping, which tells you something about the scope. And then you can focus on the ones that are overlapping and measure if they arrive at different or similar conclusions, which tells you something about measurement differences. And then lastly, you can put them together and see if weighting plays an important role to evaluate that. And so as someone who has worked with this type of data, I have great appreciation for the incredible data work that must have gone into this, because this is an incredible amount of data that needs to be sort of evaluated carefully and impressive. So the main result is that the bulk of the differences between these ratings really comes from differences in measurement and scope, and to a much lesser degree from weighting differences. And the results that Florian showed on his slides, it actually didn't come out as clearly because he just showed the sort of arithmetic disaggregation. There's another methodology in the paper that chooses a different approach, where the importance of the weighting is much less strong. And at the end of the day, this is actually bad news. So this is bad news for practitioners and for investors and for anyone who wants to use these ratings, because it means that you cannot simply take the individual data items from the company's raw data and assign a common weighting to them and arrive at the same conclusion, but that the differences really are due to the way that these firms measure and due to the choices they make into what to cover. And so let me just tell you my overall sort of comments for this paper. I think it's very well executed. It's easy to read and covers an important area that that people are interested in right now. I already said I think this is impressive data work. What I think really the potential is that this paper could open, with this framework, open up the door to further research and additional research in the future, right? The most interesting part being this rater fixed effect, the idea that depending on who the rater is, the rating that they assign to companies sort of is similar across different categories, independent of what the actual characteristic of the firm is. And so my hope for this paper really is that, given that this framework is in place and the authors have set up this this data, first of all, and second, this framework of thinking about the differences, that they in the future choose this to go after really interesting and important economic questions. So my discussion and my main comments, I'm going to really focus more on high-level thoughts and comments that talk more about sort of where to take this in the future, how to position it, what we can learn from it, and less sort of on the nitty-gritty methodology that is behind it. Because I think it would be really interesting if the authors could take this framework in the future and apply it to interesting sort of economic questions that help us understand sort of really where these differences come from. So first of all, I would encourage the authors to take a close look at the recent literature that deals with these ESG ratings and work out a little bit more detailed and sort of point out a little bit more, first of all, how what they're doing is different, and how it also helps us think about and understand these previous results. So there is an emerging literature that does focus on the fact that there are these pretty large disagreements in ESG ratings. So we kind of know that that's the case. One of the first papers that documents this is Chatterjee, and the authors acknowledge that, right? So they point to these papers, but if you take a close look at the Chatterjee paper, for example, it says that ESG ratings differences can be due to either what they call common theorization, which is about measuring the same thing, and I don't know how to pronounce this, commensurability. So this is about how to measure the items that are overlapping. And so conceptually, I think those two ideas of common theorization and commensurability are very similar to the idea of splitting this into scope and measurement. And so in a sense, there's a large overlap between this paper here and the Chatterjee paper. And I would like to sort of understand a little bit more how this paper can help us understand these other papers. There are other papers that take this ESG ratings differences as given and try to explain where it's coming from, right? So there's an Eccles paper that looks at the social origins and market differentiation as drivers of ESG ratings differences. There's a recent paper by Seraphim and others that looks at differences in ESG disclosure requirements as the main driver of this of the ESG ratings differences. And there's another recent paper by Gibson, Kruger, and Schmidt that looks at the civil law and common law background of the ratings agencies as a key driver of these ESG differences, and then uses that to predict stock returns. And I think with this taxonomy and with this categorization, it's breaking down of scope, measurement, and weighting, this paper could actually help us shed a lot of light on these other papers and help us think about these drivers. Because if really the differences are mainly due to scope or due to measurement, it has important implications for what these other papers have documented, right? If this has a lot to do with its disclosure requirements, then we should see the differences mainly show up in measurement differences, right? If this has a lot to do with the way that these firms were founded and their social origins or their legal origins, it would have implications and say that you should see differences in what they cover because of their differences in values and and what types of choices they make. And so I think there's room here for shedding light on these related papers with this particular methodology. My second main comment is a little bit more about the results themselves and about how it's constructed, and that is really about the question, what is behind this measurement difference, right? So among those three things, scope, measurement, and weighting, I think measurement really is the most interesting part, because scope is easy to think about and almost trivial. It's just, okay, we're choosing to measure different things, and weighting is quite similar and doesn't explain as much. Where it's really interesting is, where do these measurement differences come from? And in the paper, measurement differences are sort of one large category, but if you think about it more, you could think about measurement differences really as something you can break down into two things. You can choose to use different indicators to sort of study the same attribute. That's the example that's given in the paper. So if you want to measure gender equality, you could do this by focusing on the gender wage gap or female board representation or something else. So in this case, it's obvious you're going to arrive at different conclusions because you're choosing different indicators to sort of capture the same attribute. Alternatively, you could also arrive at different conclusions by studying the exact same indicator but evaluating it differently, right? So Asset 4 has these, for example, yes or no questions, where they ask things like, does the company have a commitment to reducing resource usage, right? So even if the two rating agencies are evaluating exactly the same thing with exactly the same item and the same question, because this is a relatively subjective question, you can still arrive at different conclusions. And so rather than just calling this measurement, I think it would be interesting to break this down further and understand if this is really because the companies choose different items and that's a choice that they make and we don't really know why they make this choice, or if they focus on the same things but come to different conclusions looking at the same item. This gets me to the next point that's kind of closely related. All of these rating agencies kind of mix what I would call quantifiable and what I would call subjective data items. So that's the combination of things like CO2 emissions, which you can just sort of verify and take a number and measure it very objectively, and other things such as subjective evaluations of the company's policies. The paper speaks to this a little bit, but I would really like to see sort of a quantitative breakdown of how much of this divergence comes from quantifiable data versus subjective data. This is also important because I'm not sure in how far some of these different ratings are comparable on the surface. Some of them, such as KLD, provide only sort of process information, right? So every strength or every weakness is the result of a KLD analyst looking at some underlying data. We don't know what that data is and deciding if it's a strength or a weakness. On the other hand, Asset 4, for example, you observe the actual raw numbers, the actual raw data. And so I'm not sure in how far it's fair to compare this type of process subjective evaluation from the ratings agency with a relatively objective, fairly measured number. And then lastly, there's an interesting observation in this paper by Christensen, Serafim, and Sakachi, who say that a lot of this ESG disclosure is due to the fact that there are, a lot of this ESG ratings difference is due to the fact that their disclosure requirements are different. And so whenever there is no data available and the companies just all report missing information or do not report any information, the ratings differences and divergence is actually small because there isn't much to disagree about. On the other hand, if there is information, then the companies start agreeing. And so I think that's a concern for some of the measurement results in the sense that it's not clear if the overlap and if the divergence in measurement is due to the fact that there actually is data available, and in the cases where they agree, it's because there is no data available. So I'd just like to see a breakdown of that in the paper as well. And then last, I think I have to go a little bit faster. Last this is almost the most interesting or the most important comment that I have. I'm curious, we have this amazing machinery in place now. We have this data from 6 different agencies. We have a framework that allows us to think what these differences represent. What are we going to do with this? Like, how can we answer interesting economic questions with this now that we have this, this in place? So the paper documents the strong rating agency fixed effects, but doesn't really attempt to explain where they come from or what they represent, like some of these other papers have done, trying to pin this on social norms or backgrounds of the rating agencies, or legal backgrounds, or competitive issues, or marketing pressures. So it would be really interesting to see the authors use this methodology and not just look at one cross-section in 2014, but maybe construct this over a period of time and then look at interesting economic questions with it. For example, do these ESG ratings agencies respond to competitive pressure, right? Do we see that as more and more ESG rating agencies enter the market, the ESG ratings start to diversify, they start covering different attributes, so we see an increase in the scope divergence. Do they improve their quality? So we see a decrease in the measurement divergence. This framework of breaking it into scope, measurement, weighting could help us understand some of these questions better, because we can see how firms or how these rating agencies respond to certain pressures. Similarly, we could ask questions about agency concerns in these ESG ratings. We've seen that some of these raters have been taken over by large financial services firms, S&P, Morningstar, Moody's. Do we see that the divergence of this particular ratings agency from the others increases after these takeovers, maybe because of the clients that these financial services firms have? So I would be really curious to see how in the future, and I'm sure the authors are already thinking about this, how the authors are going to take this machinery and answer questions that could help us shed light on where these differences come from, because now we can understand, is it a difference in what they measure, or is it a difference in how they measure the things that they measure? I think I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to skip my minor comments. I'll send you those later on. Let me summarize. I think this is interesting. I think there will be a lot of citations for this paper in future years, because it sheds light on data that we're pretty much all using all of the time. I think it documents some very interesting and important stylized facts, and I really hope that in the future I'll see another paper from the authors that takes this machinery and tries to understand sort of economically what the drivers are of these differences. All right, thank you.